My son asked me for $100,000 for his new business idea. I said no. 2 days later, his wife handed me a cup of coffee and said, "It's made especially for you." It smelled strange, so I quietly swapped it with her mother's. 1 hour later. I once believed the deadliest enemies were found out there, in the cutthroat world of business, but I learned a terrifying truth: sometimes, they're the ones sleeping right under your own roof. This isn't just a story, it's a chilling tale of family betrayal, a 10-year plot for murder, and the kind of revenge that makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice. My name is Colleen Princewell. At 68, I thought I understood the true cost of wealth. When you inherit an oil fortune worth $80 million, money doesn't just talk, it screams, it lies, and sometimes, it kills. But I never, not in a million years, imagined the greatest threat to my life would come wearing my son's face and calling me Mom. The Princewell estate, 500 sprawling acres of prime Texas land, was where my grandfather had bled and fought to claim his liquid gold. The mansion itself was a testament to 3 generations of prosperity: 14 rooms of hand-carved mahogany, crystal chandeliers, and Persian rugs that cost more than most people's houses. It was beautiful, yes, imposing, absolutely, but utterly lonely since my husband, Charles, died 5 years ago. I was left to manage an empire I'd never truly wanted. That Tuesday morning in October, it started like any other. I was in my study, going over quarterly reports from our various oil fields, when I heard the familiar rumble of Blake's BMW crunching up the circular drive. My 35-year-old son rarely visited without an agenda. And as I watched him through the bay windows, I could see the tension in his shoulders, even from a distance. Blake had always been handsome, in that privileged, prep school way that opened doors and often closed minds. But lately, something had changed. The easy confidence of his youth had been replaced by a desperate hunger that just made me deeply uncomfortable. It was the look of a man who'd tasted failure and found it incredibly bitter. "Mom," he burst into my study without knocking, his expensive suit wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. "We need to talk." I slowly took off my reading glasses and studied his face. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and there was a tremor in his hands he was trying desperately to hide. "Of course, sweetheart. Sit down. You look terrible." "Thanks for the pep talk," Blake muttered, collapsing into the leather chair across from my mahogany desk. "Look, I'm going to cut straight to the chase. I need money. A lot of money." Here we go again, I thought. Blake's business ventures had a history of requiring my financial intervention. His last startup, some sort of app for rating restaurants, had cost me $300,000 before folding spectacularly. Before that, it was a clothing line that never even made it past the design phase. Each failure was followed by elaborate explanations about market timing and investor politics, but the result was always the same: my bank account got lighter while Blake's promises got emptier. "How much?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. 100,000. The number hung in the air between us, like smoke from a gunshot. It was more than he'd ever asked for before, and the way he said it, like he was ordering coffee, set off every single alarm bell in my head. "That's a substantial amount, Blake. What's this venture?" "It's a tech startup, a revolutionary online marketing platform that's going to change everything." His words came out in a practiced rush, like he'd rehearsed this pitch in the mirror. "My partner has connections with Fortune 500 companies, and we're projecting 7-figure profits in the first year alone." I'd heard variations of this song before, and it never ended well. "Who's your partner?" Blake's eyes flickered away from mine. "You don't know him. He's from California. Tech background, proven track record." "What's his name?" "Mom, why does it matter? The opportunity is what's important here." The evasion was telling. In 30 years of cross-examining witnesses as a prosecutor, I'd learned to recognize the sound of lies being born. Blake was hiding something, and whatever it was, it required $100,000 to fix. "Blake, we've had this conversation before, multiple times. I've supported your business dreams generously, and none of them have succeeded. Perhaps it's time you tried building something with your own resources." The transformation was immediate, and frankly, frightening. Blake's face darkened, and his hands clenched into fists on his lap. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of his father, my ex-husband, who'd tried to manipulate me out of my inheritance before I divorced him 15 years ago. "My own resources." Blake's voice rose to a near shout. "What resources, Mom? I'm drowning here. Do you have any idea what it's like to live in the shadow of all this?" He gestured wildly at the opulent study around us. "Everyone expects me to be successful because I'm a Princewell. But how can I compete when you control everything? I've given you every advantage." "Advantages?" Blake laughed bitterly. "You've given me just enough to fail spectacularly. Just enough to make me look like a spoiled rich kid who can't make it on his own, but never enough to actually succeed. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. I had been careful about how much money I gave Blake, perhaps too careful, but I'd seen too many wealthy families destroyed by children who never learned the value of work. Blake, calm down. Let's discuss this rationally. There's nothing to discuss. I need that money, and I need it now. This isn't a request, Mom. It's a necessity. His voice dropped, chilling me to my core. Give me the money, Mom. You'll soon die anyway. I felt my blood chill. My son wanted me dead. Something in his tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't the petulant demand of a spoiled child. This was something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to a threat. The answer is no, Blake. I won't be investing in another one of your ventures. He stood up so abruptly that his chair rocked backward. Fine. But don't come crying to me when you're older and alone because you chose money over family. The words hit like a slap, but it was the cold calculation in his eyes that really terrified me. This wasn't anger anymore. This was something much worse. Blake, is there something you're not telling me? Are you in some kind of trouble? For just a moment, his mask slipped completely. I saw fear there, and desperation, and something that looked like genuine panic. But then the cold expression returned, and he headed for the door. Forget I asked, he said without turning around. I'll figure it out myself. As Blake's BMW tore down the driveway, kicking up gravel and dust, I sat alone in my study, feeling like I just dodged a bullet I didn't understand. Something was very wrong with my son, and whatever it was, it required $100,000 to solve. I picked up the phone to call my private investigator, then set it down again. Blake was my son, my flesh and blood. Whatever trouble he was in, we could work through it together. That decision would nearly cost me my life. 2 days later, Blake returned with his wife, Skylar, and immediately I knew this wasn't a social visit. Where Blake's previous approach had been desperate and direct, this felt calculated and strategic. They arrived at exactly 10 a.m., not early enough to seem overeager, not late enough to appear disrespectful. The timing felt deliberate. I watched from my kitchen window as they got out of Blake's car. Even from a distance, Skylar commanded attention. She was beautiful in that sharp, expensive way that required considerable maintenance, platinum blonde hair that moved like silk, designer clothes that fit her model-thin frame perfectly, and an aura of confidence that came from knowing she was the most attractive person in any room. Blake and Skylar had been married for 3 years, but I never felt truly comfortable around my daughter-in-law. There was something theatrical about her interactions with me, like she was playing a role rather than being herself. She always said exactly what people wanted to hear, but her eyes remained calculating and cold. Colleen, I hope you don't mind us dropping by, Skylar said as she glided into my kitchen, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee in delicate china mugs. She moved with the kind of practiced grace that made every gesture look like a performance. I brought you something special. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who'd spent considerable time preparing for this visit. I made this just for you, Skylar continued, extending one of the cups toward me with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. It's a special blend I picked up from that boutique coffee shop downtown. Ethiopian beans with Madagascar vanilla. I thought you might enjoy trying something new. The coffee smelled wrong. Not exactly burnt, but sharp and bitter, with an underlying chemical odor that reminded me of almonds mixed with something medicinal. After 30 years of prosecuting criminals, you develop an instinct for danger. Every nerve in my body was screaming that something was off, but I kept my expression neutral. How thoughtful of you, dear, I said, accepting the cup while studying Skylar's face. She was watching me with an intensity that felt predatory, like a cat watching a mouse approach a trap. Blake lingered by the kitchen doorway, and I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes. His usual nervous energy had been replaced by a strange stillness that made him look like he was holding his breath. When I glanced at him, he quickly looked away, focusing on his phone with obvious discomfort. Blake tells me you two had a little disagreement the other day, Skylar said, settling gracefully into the chair across from me with her own cup. About business opportunities and family support. The way she said, family support, made it sound like an obligation rather than a choice. I noticed she hadn't taken a sip of her coffee yet, despite encouraging me to drink mine. We had a discussion about financial boundaries, I said carefully. Blake has some wonderful entrepreneurial energy, but I think it's important for him to develop his own resources. Of course, Skylar agreed, her smile never wavering. Independence is so important, though it can be challenging when family members have such different perspectives on success. When Skylar turned slightly to glance at Blake, I made a split-second decision that would save my life. Using the moment when her attention was diverted, I quickly switched our cups. They were identical white china mugs, and the exchange took less than 2 seconds. Blake's told me so much about his latest venture, I said, testing to see how much Skylar knew about her husband's mysterious business partner. It sounds very promising. Something flickered in Skylar's eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or annoyance. Yes, he's very excited about the potential. And his partner? Blake mentioned someone from California with tech experience. Skylar hummed noncommittally, raising her cup, which was now my original one, to her lips. Innovation is so important in today's market. We chatted about meaningless things while I pretended to sip my coffee and watched Skylar take her first real drink. Her face twisted slightly, like she tasted something unpleasant, and I saw her eyes widen with what looked like confusion, but she said nothing about the flavor, which was interesting. This is delicious, I lied, setting my cup down after another fake sip. You'll have to tell me where you found this blend. The shop on Elm Street, Skylar said abruptly, and I could see her mind working, trying to process something that didn't make sense to her. Blake was checking his watch with increasing frequency, and there was a tension in the room that felt like a storm building on the horizon. Whatever they'd come here to accomplish wasn't going according to plan. 20 minutes later, Skylar started coughing. It began as a small, polite clearing of her throat, but quickly escalated into deep, violent spasms that shook her entire body. Her face flushed red, then began taking on a grayish pallor that made her look genuinely ill. Something's wrong, she gasped, gripping the edge of the table as the coughing grew worse. Her voice was becoming hoarse and strained. I can't breathe properly. Blake rushed over from his position by the door, his concern appearing genuine, or at least well acted. Skylar, what's happening? Are you having an allergic reaction? Hospital, she wheezed, her breathing becoming increasingly labored. Need to go to the hospital now. As we rushed to prepare for the emergency room, Skylar leaning heavily on Blake while making appropriately distressed noises, one thought kept repeating in my mind, that coffee had been meant for me. Which meant my loving daughter-in-law had just poisoned herself with her own murder weapon. The irony was so perfect, it almost made me smile. The ride to Mercy General Hospital felt like a scene from a medical drama, complete with Skylar's increasingly theatrical symptoms and Blake's perfectly calibrated concern. I sat in the back seat, watching this performance unfold, marveling at the precision of their act. Skylar's breathing had become labored and raspy. Her skin was flushed and blotchy, and she was clutching her throat like she was fighting for every breath. If I hadn't known better, I would have been genuinely worried about her condition. But knowing what I knew about the coffee's intended target, I found myself studying her symptoms with clinical detachment. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Blake asked for the third time in 10 minutes, his voice pitched perfectly between concern and panic. Just hold on. We're almost there. Burns, Skylar managed to gasp between coughing fits. Throat burning. Cyanide poisoning. I realized. The almond smell. The respiratory distress. The burning sensation. Someone had done their homework. Cyanide was fast-acting, difficult to detect without specific tests, and would cause exactly the symptoms Skylar was experiencing. If she'd given me the full dose intended for my body weight, I would likely be dead by now. The emergency room at Mercy General was controlled chaos, with the usual mix of genuine emergencies and hypochondriacs that made triage such an art form. But Skylar's condition was dramatic enough to get immediate attention. We need help. Blake called out as we entered, supporting his wife, who was now making choking sounds that would have been alarming if they weren't so perfectly timed. My wife can't breathe. The medical team responded with impressive efficiency. Within minutes, Skylar was on a gurney, hooked up to monitors, and surrounded by nurses taking vitals and asking rapid-fire questions. When did the symptoms start? Dr. Amanda Rodriguez asked, clipboard in hand and stethoscope around her neck. About 30 minutes ago, Blake answered, playing the role of concerned husband to perfection. She was fine this morning, then suddenly started coughing and having trouble breathing. Any known allergies? Medications? Recent changes in diet or environment? Nothing, Blake said. She's always been perfectly healthy. I watched this exchange with growing fascination. Blake was answering all the questions smoothly, never hesitating, never appearing uncertain. Either he was remarkably calm under pressure, or he'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Rodriguez addressed Skylar directly. Can you tell me what you were doing just before the symptoms started? Coffee, Skylar whispered, her voice barely audible. Having coffee with her. Her eyes found mine across the small examination area. The way she said, her, carried an unmistakable note of accusation. Even in her supposedly weakened state, Skylar was already laying the groundwork for what was to come. Dr. Rodriguez followed Skylar's gaze to me. Are you family? I'm her mother-in-law, I said. We were having morning coffee when she became ill. Did you both drink the same coffee? Similar, I said carefully. Skylar prepared it. 2 cups from the same pot. Dr. Rodriguez made notes on her clipboard, and I could see the wheels turning in her medical mind. Food poisoning was always a possibility when multiple people consumed the same substance, but only one person getting sick suggested either an allergic reaction or something more sinister. We're going to run some blood tests, Dr. Rodriguez announced. In the meantime, let's get you on oxygen and see if we can make you more comfortable. As the medical team worked on Skylar, Blake turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mom, I'm going to run home and get some of her things. Pajamas, medications. You know how hospitals are. Of course, sweetheart, I said, patting his arm. Take your time. It was interesting how quickly Blake was leaving, especially when his wife was potentially fighting for her life. Either he was remarkably trusting of the medical staff, or he had somewhere else he needed to be, urgently. I settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair in the waiting area, surrounded by the familiar sounds of medical emergencies and human suffering. The magazines were outdated, the coffee was terrible, and the fluorescent lighting made everyone look slightly dead. It was the perfect setting for contemplating attempted murder. 3 hours later, Blake returned with an overnight bag, looking appropriately exhausted and worried. His timing was impeccable. He walked through the door just as Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the treatment area with news. We found traces of cyanide in her bloodstream, Dr. Rodriguez announced with clinical precision. This appears to be deliberate poisoning. I'm required by law to contact the authorities. Cyanide? The word hung in the air like an accusation. Blake's face went pale, and he grabbed my arm as if seeking support. Poisoning, he repeated, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine shock. But how? Who would do something like that? Before Dr. Rodriguez could answer, Skylar's voice rang out from behind the curtain, weak, but remarkably clear for someone who'd been at death's door. She did it. Skylar said, her finger pointing directly at me when the curtain was pulled back. Colleen poisoned my coffee. She tried to kill me. The accusation hit the room like a bomb. Dr. Rodriguez stared at me with a mixture of shock and suspicion while Blake looked like he'd been slapped. That's impossible, Blake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mom would never, she made the coffee herself. Skylar continued, her voice getting stronger with each word. She handed it to me personally. She watched me drink it. Well, that was gratitude for you. Here, I'd inadvertently saved her life by switching cups, and she was repaying the favor by trying to frame me for attempted murder. The irony was delicious, even if the consequences were likely to be serious. Detective James Morrison arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes of Dr. Rodriguez's call, which suggested that attempted murder cases received priority attention in our quiet Texas town. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every lie in the book. Mrs. Princewell, Detective Morrison said, introducing himself with a firm handshake. I understand there's been an incident involving poisoning. I'd like to speak with you privately if that's all right. We moved to a small consultation room down the hall from where Skylar was still receiving treatment. The room was sterile and windowless, designed for delivering bad news and uncomfortable conversations. I want to be clear from the start, Detective Morrison began, opening his notebook. You're not under arrest, and you're free to leave at any time, but I need to understand what happened here today. I told him exactly what had occurred. The strange smell in the coffee, my instinct to switch the cups, Skylar drinking what was originally meant for me. I kept my explanation factual and straightforward, the way I taught witnesses to testify during my years as a prosecutor. Mrs. Princewell, Detective Morrison said when I finished. If you suspected the coffee was dangerous, why didn't you simply refuse to drink it or warn Mrs. Morrison? It was the logical question, and one I'd been preparing to answer since the moment Skylar started coughing. I wasn't completely certain something was wrong, I said. It was more of an instinct than a concrete suspicion. I thought switching the cups would be a way to test my concerns without creating unnecessary drama if I was wrong. And when Mrs. Morrison became ill, I realized my instinct had been correct. Someone had tried to poison me, and Skylar had accidentally become the victim instead. Detective Morrison made careful notes, his expression revealing nothing about whether he believed my story. Who else knew you were having coffee this morning? Only Blake and Skylar. It was a spur-of-the-moment visit. Had you been experiencing any threats lately? Anyone who might want to harm you? I thought about Blake's desperate request for money and his angry departure 2 days earlier, but something held me back from mentioning it. Whatever my son was involved in, I wanted to understand it fully before involving the police. Nothing specific, I said. When you have significant wealth, you're always aware that some people might see you as a target. When Detective Morrison interviewed Blake, I could hear the conversation through the thin walls of the consultation room. My son's responses sent chills down my spine. My mother's been acting strange lately, Blake said, his voice carrying clearly through the wall. I mean, I don't think she'd actually hurt anyone, but she's been more paranoid than usual. Suspicious of everyone. In what way? Just little things. Asking a lot of questions about Skylar's background, making comments about gold diggers and people who marry for money. I thought it was just normal mother-in-law stuff, but now. The doubt in Blake's voice was unmistakable. My own son was throwing me under the bus, creating reasonable doubt about my mental state and suggesting I might be capable of poisoning his wife. Has she ever expressed any direct animosity toward your wife? She's never said anything outright hostile, but there's been tension. Mom can be very controlling when it comes to family money. She doesn't like anyone she thinks might be after her fortune. Each word was a carefully placed knife in my back. Blake was painting a picture of a paranoid, controlling old woman who might poison her daughter-in-law out of jealousy and suspicion. It was brilliant character assassination, and it was coming from my own child. When Detective Morrison returned to question me further, his entire demeanor had changed. The polite, professional courtesy had been replaced by a barely concealed suspicion. Mrs. Princewell, I need to ask you some direct questions. Have you been concerned about your daughter-in-law's intentions regarding your family's wealth? The question was clearly based on what Blake had told him. I chose my words carefully. I think it's natural for any parent to be protective of their family's assets, but I've never had any specific reason to distrust Skylar. Your son mentioned that you've been acting more suspicious lately. Is there any truth to that? I don't believe I've been acting any differently than usual. Blake may be interpreting normal caution as suspicion. Detective Morrison made more notes, and I could see him building a case in his mind. Wealthy older woman, suspicious of young daughter-in-law. History of controlling behavior around money, opportunity, and means to commit poisoning. Mrs. Princewell, I'm going to need to examine your home as part of this investigation. Do I have your permission to conduct a search? I knew I could refuse and demand a warrant, but that would only make me look more guilty. Of course. I have nothing to hide. We'll also need to examine any computers, phones, or other devices that might contain relevant information. Whatever you need, Detective. As we prepared to leave the hospital, I caught one last glimpse of Skylar through the gap in her room's curtain. She was sitting up in bed, no longer appearing to struggle for breath, engaged in quiet conversation with a nurse. When she saw me looking, she offered a small, satisfied smile that made my blood run cold. That smile told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The search of my home was thorough, professional, and utterly devastating. Detective Morrison arrived with a full forensics team and a warrant that gave them permission to examine every inch of my property. I watched from my living room as strangers in latex gloves went through my most personal possessions, looking for evidence that I was a would-be murderer. We appreciate your cooperation, Mrs. Princewell, Detective Morrison said as his team spread throughout the house. This should only take a few hours. I sat in my study, the same room where Blake had demanded money just 3 days earlier, and tried to process how quickly my life had spiraled out of control. 72 hours ago, I'd been a wealthy widow living quietly on her family's estate. Now, I was the prime suspect in an attempted murder case. The forensics team worked with methodical precision, photographing everything, dusting for fingerprints, and collecting samples from surfaces throughout the house. They paid particular attention to the kitchen, where Skylar claimed to have prepared the poison coffee. Ma'am, one of the technicians called from the kitchen. Can you show us where the coffee supplies are kept? I led them to the pantry, where my housekeeper kept various coffee beans, filters, and accessories. Everything looked normal to me, but the technicians treated each item like potential evidence, carefully bagging and labeling anything that might have come into contact with poison. What about cleaning supplies? Detective Morrison asked. Anything that might contain chemical compounds. I showed them to the utility room, where we kept the usual household chemicals, bleach, ammonia, drain cleaners, and various other toxic substances that could be found in any home. Again, they photographed and sampled everything. 2 hours into the search, I heard one of the technicians call out from the guest bathroom upstairs. Detective Morrison, you need to see this. The excitement in his voice made my stomach clench. I followed Detective Morrison upstairs, dreading what they might have found. In the guest bathroom, a room I rarely used and hadn't even entered in weeks, they discovered a small glass vial hidden behind the medicine cabinet. The vial contained traces of a clear liquid, and beside it was a handwritten list that included Skylar's name along with what appeared to be dosage calculations. Mrs. Princewell, Detective Morrison said, holding up an evidence bag containing the vial and list. Can you explain these items? I stared at the evidence, feeling the world tilt around me. The handwriting on the list looked remarkably similar to mine, though I had no memory of writing anything like it. The vial was completely unfamiliar. I've never seen either of those items before, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. This is your handwriting, isn't it? Detective Morrison pressed, showing me the list more closely. Looking at it carefully, I had to admit that it did look like my handwriting, the formation of the letters, the particular way I crossed my T's and dotted my I's. Whoever had written this had either studied my writing extensively, or... Detective Morrison, I said slowly. I need to tell you something important. While we were at the hospital this morning, Blake left for several hours to get Skylar's belongings from their house. He would have had access to my home during that time. Are you suggesting your son planted this evidence? The words sounded insane even as I said them, but I couldn't ignore the obvious timeline. I'm saying that someone with access to my house and knowledge of my handwriting could have placed these items here while we were at the hospital. Detective Morrison studied me carefully. Mrs. Princewell, that's a very serious accusation to make against your own son. It's not an accusation. It's an observation about opportunity and access. But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in Detective Morrison's eyes. The grieving mother caught red-handed with evidence of attempted murder, trying to blame her innocent son. It was exactly the kind of desperate deflection that guilty people attempted when cornered. We'll be taking these items for analysis, Detective Morrison said, sealing the evidence bags along with samples of my handwriting for comparison. Of course, Mrs. Princewell, I have to ask. Do you own any firearms? The question caught me off guard. Yes, I have a pistol in my bedroom safe. Why? We'll need to examine that as well. I led them to my bedroom and opened the safe, revealing a .38 caliber revolver that Charles had insisted I keep for protection. The gun was exactly where I'd left it, and I couldn't imagine how it related to a poisoning case. Has this weapon been fired recently? Detective Morrison asked. Not in over a year. I occasionally take it to the shooting range for practice, but I haven't done that in months. They bagged the gun anyway, along with the box of ammunition from the safe. I was beginning to understand that in a criminal investigation, everything was potentially relevant until proven otherwise. As the search team finished their work, Detective Morrison pulled me aside for a final conversation. Mrs. Princewell, based on what we found today, I need to inform you that you're now considered a person of interest in this case. I strongly recommend that you contact an attorney. Am I under arrest? Not at this time, but I advise you not to leave town without notifying my office. After the police left, I walked through my home, seeing it with new eyes. Rooms that had been photographed and searched, surfaces that had been dusted for fingerprints, possessions that had been examined for evidence of criminal intent. My sanctuary had been violated, and I felt like a stranger in my own house. But more than that, I felt the weight of betrayal settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Someone had planned this carefully, planting evidence that would point directly to me while creating a perfect cover story. And the only person who'd had the opportunity, access, and knowledge to do it was my own son. That night, I sat in my study with a glass of wine, staring at the oil derricks visible through my window. The mechanical pumps continued their steady rhythm, extracting wealth from the earth, just as they had for 3 generations. But for the first time since inheriting this empire, I wondered if it would all die with me. Blake hadn't just tried to rob me. He tried to murder me and frame me for the attempted murder of his wife. The complexity and cruelty of the plan took my breath away. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated his mother. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. Harrison Cole speaking. Harrison, it's Colleen. I need your help. Someone's trying to destroy me, and I think it might be my own son. Harrison Cole had been my closest colleague during my 25 years as a prosecutor. And more importantly, he was the only person who truly understood how my mind worked. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it would be him, Harrison said, his voice immediately shifting to the sharp focus I remembered from our courtroom days. Tell me everything. Don't leave out a single detail. Harrison listened without interruption as I explained the entire sequence of events, Blake's desperate request for money, the poison coffee, the convenient evidence planted in my home, and Blake's calculated betrayal during the police interviews. Jesus Christ, Harrison said when I finished. If Blake is behind this, we're dealing with attempted murder and conspiracy charges. This isn't just about money anymore. I know. The question is how to prove it. First things first, you need criminal defense representation immediately. I'm going to call Marcus Webb. He's the best defense attorney in the state, and he owes me a favor from the Anderson case. Harrison, there's something else. I think Blake might be in serious trouble with dangerous people. The way he demanded that money, the desperation in his voice, this feels like more than just another failed business venture. What kind of trouble? I don't know yet, but I want to find out. If Blake is involved with criminals, it might explain why he's willing to commit murder for inheritance money. Harrison was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking. I still have contacts in law enforcement. Let me make some discreet inquiries about Blake's recent activities. But in the meantime, you need to assume you're under surveillance. Everything you do, everywhere you go, everyone you talk to, the police will be watching. I understand. And be very careful around Blake and Skylar. If they're willing to commit murder once, they won't hesitate to try again. Marcus Webb arrived at my house that evening carrying a briefcase and the kind of serious expression that defense attorneys wear when their clients are in deep trouble. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 50s, but Harrison assured me that his age was offset by his brilliance and his complete lack of ethics when it came to protecting his clients. Mrs. Princewell, Marcus said, settling into my study like he owned the place. Harrison has briefed me on your situation. You're in significant legal jeopardy, but the case against you has some interesting weaknesses. The timeline, for one. The poisoning appears to have been planned in advance, but you had no way of knowing that Blake and Skylar would visit you this morning. If you were planning to poison your daughter-in-law, you would need advanced notice of her presence. Unless the prosecution argues that I was planning to poison Blake, and Skylar was an unlucky bystander. I knew how a good prosecutor thought. Yes, they could argue that. But there's another problem with their case, motive. Meaning, why would you want to kill Blake? He's your son and your only heir. His death would actually complicate your estate planning significantly. I thought about the life insurance policy I suspected might exist, but decided to keep that information to myself for now. What about Skylar? They could argue I wanted to eliminate her to protect Blake's inheritance. Possibly, but that's a weak motive for murder. Wealthy families deal with gold-digging spouses through prenups and trusts, not poison. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. Tell me about the evidence they found in your house, the vial and the handwritten list. I described the items in detail, emphasizing how the handwriting looked like mine, but that I had no memory of creating the list. Marcus made careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the timeline and Blake's access to my home. The planted evidence is actually our strongest defense, Marcus said. It's almost too convenient. Real poisoners don't usually leave behind signed confessions with their victim's name and dosage calculations. What's our next step? We need to investigate Blake and Skylar independently. If they're running a con, there will be evidence, financial records, communication patterns, possibly even previous victims. Previous victims. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. If your son is willing to murder his own mother for inheritance money, this probably isn't his first rodeo. People don't usually jump straight to matricide without working their way up through smaller crimes. The thought sent ice through my veins. You think they've done this before? I think we need to find out. Harrison is already running background checks on both of them. If there are any red flags in their past, we'll find them. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. I'd installed a state-of-the-art security system years ago, but knowing that my son had keys and access codes made it feel useless. Around 3 a.m., I heard a car in my driveway. From my bedroom window, I could see Blake's BMW parked near the front door. I watched as he sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, making phone calls and appearing agitated. Finally, he got out and approached the house. Instead of using his key, he knocked softly on the front door. When I didn't answer, he tried the handle and found it locked. He walked around the perimeter of the house, testing windows and checking for other entry points. This wasn't the behavior of a concerned son checking on his mother. This was reconnaissance. After 20 minutes, Blake gave up and drove away. I immediately called Marcus Webb. He was casing the house, I told Marcus, looking for ways to get inside without using his key. Did you record any of this? The security cameras should have captured everything. Perfect. Don't touch those recordings. We'll need them if this goes to trial. The next morning brought more bad news. Detective Morrison called to inform me that the preliminary forensics results had confirmed my fingerprints on the poison vial and that the handwriting analysis was consistent with my writing samples. Mrs. Princewell, Detective Morrison said, I need you to come to the station for additional questioning. You have the right to have called Marcus. They're moving faster than I expected, Marcus said. This feels like they're building toward an arrest. We need to accelerate our own investigation. That afternoon, as Marcus and I sat in the police station waiting room, I felt the walls closing in around me. The evidence against me was circumstantial but compelling. I had motive, protecting family wealth, means, access to poison, and opportunity, preparing the coffee. The planted evidence provided the smoking gun that would convince a jury of my guilt. Mrs. Princewell, Detective Morrison said when we were finally called into the interview room. We've received additional forensic results that I think you should be aware of. Marcus leaned forward slightly. What kind of results? The poison found in Mrs. Morrison's bloodstream is an exact match for the substance in the vial recovered from Mrs. Princewell's home. We also found traces of the same substance on a coffee mug in Mrs. Princewell's kitchen. My heart sank. They'd found physical evidence linking me directly to the crime. Even if I could prove the evidence was planted, it would be difficult to convince a jury that someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to frame me. Detective Morrison, Marcus said smoothly. My client maintains her innocence. This evidence is clearly the result of contamination or tampering. By whom? By the real perpetrator who had access to Mrs. Princewell's home while she was at the hospital. Detective Morrison looked skeptical. You're suggesting that someone else poisoned Mrs. Morrison, then broke into Mrs. Princewell's house to plant evidence. I'm suggesting that the timeline and circumstances don't support the conclusion that my client is guilty of this crime. But I could see in Detective Morrison's eyes that he'd already made up his mind. To him, I was a wealthy old woman who tried to murder her daughter-in-law and was now desperately trying to blame her innocent son. Mrs. Princewell, Detective Morrison said, based on the evidence we've gathered, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder. As the handcuffs clicked around my wrists, I looked at Marcus and saw my own fears reflected in his eyes. Blake and Skylar had played this perfectly, and I was about to pay the price for underestimating my own family. But as they led me toward the patrol car, one thought kept me from despair. They'd made one crucial mistake. They'd left me alive. And as long as I was breathing, I wasn't finished fighting. The county jail was everything I'd expected and worse. Gray concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look dead, and the constant sound of metal doors slamming shut. I'd sent enough criminals to places like this during my career, but experiencing it firsthand was profoundly different. My cellmate was a woman named Maria Santos, arrested for check fraud, and surprisingly philosophical about the experience. First time, she asked as I tried to make myself comfortable on the narrow bunk. Unfortunately, yes. What did you do? They think I tried to poison my daughter-in-law. Maria whistled low. Family drama. That's always the messiest kind of crime. I didn't do it. Honey, everybody in here didn't do it. But the real question is, can you prove you didn't do it? That was exactly the question keeping me awake at night. Marcus had warned me that proving innocence was much harder than establishing reasonable doubt, especially when the evidence was as seemingly solid as what they'd assembled against me. The bail hearing was set for Monday morning, 3 days away. Marcus was confident he could get me released, but the prosecution was arguing that I was a flight risk due to my substantial wealth and that I posed a danger to potential witnesses. The district attorney is treating this like a high-profile case, Marcus explained during one of his visits. They think convicting a wealthy oil heiress will be good publicity. What about our investigation into Blake and Skylar? Harrison is making progress, but it's slow going. We've confirmed that Blake has significant gambling debts, over $300,000 to some very unsavory people. That gives him clear motive for needing money quickly. $300,000. The number staggered me. How did he accumulate that kind of debt? High-stakes poker games, sports betting, some kind of cryptocurrency speculation that went wrong. The point is, he was desperate enough to do something drastic. What about Skylar? Marcus's expression darkened. That's where it gets interesting. Skylar Morrison doesn't exist. I felt my pulse quicken. Huh? What do you mean? The identity is fake. Created about 4 years ago with forged documents and a fabricated background. Harrison traced her real identity to a woman named Victoria Sterling, who has a criminal record in 3 states. What kind of record? Identity theft, fraud, and get this, suspected involvement in a suspicious death of an elderly man in Arizona. The case was never prosecuted due to lack of evidence, but the pattern is clear. Suddenly, everything made sense. Blake hadn't just married a beautiful woman. He'd married a professional criminal who specialized in exactly the kind of scheme they tried to pull on me. So, this was planned from the beginning. It looks that way. Victoria probably targeted Blake because of his family wealth, then manipulated him into helping her gain access to you. But why try to kill me? Why not just wait for me to die naturally and inherit everything? Marcus pulled out a folder from his briefcase. Because Blake isn't your heir anymore. I stared at him in confusion. What are you talking about? Harrison did some digging into your estate planning. 3 months ago, you updated your will to establish a charitable foundation instead of leaving everything to Blake. If you died today, Blake would inherit nothing. The memory came flooding back. I'd been concerned about Blake's spending habits and his series of failed business ventures. My estate attorney had suggested creating a foundation that would provide Blake with a comfortable income while ensuring the bulk of the principal fortune would be used for charitable purposes. Blake knows about the will change, Marcus continued. Your attorney's office confirmed that Blake called asking about your estate plans about 6 weeks ago. So, he knew that killing me wouldn't get him the inheritance, right? But if you were convicted of attempting to murder Skylar, the will could be challenged on grounds of mental incompetence or criminal behavior. Blake could argue that you weren't of sound mind when you changed the will. The complexity of their plan was staggering. They hadn't just tried to kill me. They tried to destroy my reputation and mental competency so that Blake could inherit my fortune even after I'd specifically disinherited him. There's more, Marcus said. We found evidence that Blake has been taking out loans against his expected inheritance. He owes money to several legitimate lenders and some very illegitimate ones. If he doesn't inherit your estate, he's not just broke, he's in physical danger from the people he owes money to. Exactly. These aren't the kind of creditors who accept payment plans. I spent that night staring at the ceiling of my cell, processing the full scope of Blake and Victoria's betrayal. My son hadn't just wanted me dead, he'd planned to completely erase my legacy. But knowledge was power, and now I had the ammunition I needed to fight back. Maria, I said to my cellmate around 2 a.m. What do you know about getting revenge on people who try to destroy your life? She rolled over and looked at me with new interest. Honey, that depends on how far you're willing to go and how much money you've got to spend. I have more money than I know what to do with, and after what they've put me through, I'm willing to go pretty far. Maria smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. In that case, you and I need to have a very interesting conversation. The bail hearing was a media circus. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, and reporters shouted questions as Marcus escorted me through the crowd. Oil heiress accused of poisoning daughter-in-law was the headline on every local news station, and I could see the story spreading to national outlets. Blake and Skylar were in the courtroom, sitting in the front row with their attorney. Skylar looked appropriately frail and victimized, while Blake played the role of the devastated son torn between loyalty to his mother and justice for his wife. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the hearing with the no-nonsense efficiency I remembered from my prosecutorial days. She listened to the arguments from both sides, reviewed the evidence, and set bail at $2 million, high enough to make a statement, but not so high as to be punitive. The defendant will surrender her passport and submit to electronic monitoring, Judge Williams announced. She is not to have any contact with the alleged victim or any witnesses in this case. As I was processed for release, Marcus pulled me aside with urgent news. Harrison found something big, he said quietly. Victoria Sterling's real name is Rebecca Martinez, and she's wanted by the FBI for a string of similar crimes across multiple states. The FBI. She's been running this scam for over a decade. Elderly victims in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and California. Always the same pattern: marry into money, kill the spouse, inherit the wealth and estate. How many victims? At least 7 that we can confirm. Maybe more. The scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise was staggering. She wasn't just a grifter. She was a serial killer who turned murder into a business model. Where is she now? That's the problem. After your arrest, both Blake and Victoria disappeared. Their house is empty. Bank accounts are closed, and nobody knows where they went. My blood ran cold. They're running. It looks that way. But here's the thing, we've been in contact with the FBI, and they're very interested in finally catching Rebecca Martinez. They're willing to work with us. What does that mean for my case? If we can prove that Rebecca Martinez poisoned herself as part of an elaborate frame job, your charges will be dropped immediately. But we need to find her first. That evening, I sat in my study with an electronic monitoring bracelet around my ankle, feeling like a prisoner in my own home. The media attention had been overwhelming, reporters camping outside my gates, helicopters circling overhead, and a constant stream of phone calls from journalists wanting my side of the story. I refused all interviews, but I watched the coverage with growing anger. Blake was giving carefully orchestrated statements to sympathetic reporters, painting himself as the tragic son of a mentally unstable mother who'd finally snapped under the pressure of aging and wealth. My mother has been increasingly paranoid over the past year, Blake told Channel 5 News. She's made accusations against multiple family members and friends, claiming they're after her money. I think the stress of managing such a large estate has affected her judgment. It was a masterful performance, designed to support the prosecution's theory that I was suffering from age-related mental decline that had led to irrational and violent behavior. But Blake had made one crucial mistake. In his eagerness to appear on television, he revealed that he and Victoria were still in the area. The interview had been conducted at a local hotel, which meant they hadn't fled as far as we'd thought. I called Marcus immediately. Did you see Blake's interview? I saw it. Harrison is already working with the FBI to trace their location. Marcus, I want to end this. All of it. I'm tired of being reactive. It's time to go on the offensive. What did you have in mind? I've been thinking about this since my conversation with Maria in jail. I want to set a trap. Use myself as bait to draw them out into the open. Colleen, that's incredibly dangerous. If Rebecca Martinez is willing to commit murder, she won't hesitate to try again. That's exactly what I'm counting on. The plan I outlined to Marcus was elegant in its simplicity. We would leak information suggesting that I'd hidden evidence that could clear my name, documents or recordings that proved Blake and Victoria had framed me. The bait would be irresistible to them because as long as that evidence existed, they would never be safe. They'll have to come after me, I explained. Either to steal the evidence or to kill me before I can use it. And when they do, the FBI will be waiting. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. This is either brilliant or suicidal. I'm not sure which. After what they've put me through, I'm not sure I care. The leak was carefully orchestrated through Harrison's media contacts. By the next morning, rumors were circulating that Colleen Princewell had discovered evidence proving her innocence and was planning to present it to authorities within 48 hours. The story was vague enough to be believable, but specific enough to create urgency. If Blake and Victoria thought I had evidence that could expose them, they would have to act quickly. All I had to do was wait for them to come to me. The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 days, I went through the motions of normal life while wearing a wire and knowing that FBI agents were positioned around my property. Every phone call could be the setup for an ambush. Every visitor could be a potential assassin. Marcus had wanted to evacuate me to a safe house, but I'd insisted on staying at the estate. If Blake and Victoria were going to make a move, it would be on familiar ground where they felt confident, and I appeared vulnerable. On the third night, they took the bait. I was in my study, pretending to review documents while actually reading a novel, when the motion sensors detected movement near the back of the house. The FBI had installed additional security equipment that would alert them to any intrusion, but I was on my own until they could respond. Blake appeared first, slipping through the French doors that led from the garden to my living room. He moved with practiced stealth, clearly familiar with the house's layout and security blind spots. Victoria followed a moment later, carrying what looked like a small medical bag. I remained in my study, but I could hear their whispered conversation through the thin walls. Where would she hide it? Victoria asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that hadn't been present when she was playing the role of sweet daughter-in-law. Probably in the safe, Blake replied. She keeps all her important documents there. What's the combination? My birthday. She's sentimental like that. They moved through my house like they owned it, searching methodically for evidence that didn't exist. I could hear drawers being opened, papers being shuffled, and the occasional curse when they came up empty-handed. Blake, Victoria said after 20 minutes of fruitless searching. Are you sure she has something? This could be a trap. She has to have something. How else would she know to switch the coffee cups? Maybe she got lucky. No, my mother's too smart for luck. She figured something out, and now she's planning to use it against us. The grudging respect in Blake's voice might have been flattering under different circumstances. Even after trying to murder me, he still recognized that he'd underestimated his opponent. We need to find her, Victoria said. Make her tell us where it is, and then we finish what we started. They found me exactly where I wanted them to, sitting in my study with my back to the door, apparently absorbed in reading documents. Blake entered first, moving with the confidence of someone who thought he had the upper hand. Hello, Mother. I turned slowly, letting surprise and fear show on my face. Blake, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to contact me. We need to talk, Blake said, while Victoria positioned herself near the door to block any escape attempt. About the evidence you think you have. I don't know what you mean. Victoria stepped forward, and I saw that she was holding a syringe. Mrs. Princewell, we know you have something that could hurt us. Tell us where it is, and this will be quick and painless. The mask was completely off now. Victoria's sweet southern accent had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. This was Rebecca Martinez, professional killer, and she was done pretending to be anything else. There is no evidence, I said, allowing my voice to shake with what appeared to be terror. I made it up. I thought if people believed I had proof of my innocence, they might look more carefully at what really happened. Blake and Victoria exchanged glances. You're lying, Blake said. She's not, Victoria replied, studying my face with professional assessment. She's telling the truth. There is no evidence. Then why are we here? Victoria smiled. And it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. Because now we know for certain that she doesn't have anything on us, which means we can finish this properly. She raised the syringe, and I saw my death reflected in her cold eyes. Wait, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Before you kill me, I need to know something. What? Was any of it real? Did Blake ever actually love me, or was this always about the money? Blake's face twisted with something that might have been genuine emotion. Mom. He loves your money, Victoria cut him off, just like I do. Just like everyone who's ever pretended to care about you. It was the cruelest thing she could have said, and it was exactly what I needed her to say. Thank you, I said quietly. For telling me the truth. Victoria frowned, confused by my response. That confusion lasted exactly long enough for the FBI agents to crash through every entrance to my study simultaneously. FBI. Hands where we can see them. The arrest was swift and efficient. Blake went down without a fight, but Victoria tried to use the syringe as a weapon before being tackled by Agent Sarah Chen. The entire encounter was over in less than 30 seconds. As they read Blake and Victoria their rights, I sat in my chair and watched my son's life implode in real time. He looked at me with something between hatred and disbelief. You set us up, he said. You tried to murder me, I replied. I just returned the favor. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Rebecca Martinez receive 4 consecutive life sentences for the murders she'd committed across multiple states. The evidence against her was overwhelming: DNA, fingerprints, financial records, and most damning of all, the recorded confession she'd made in my study. Blake received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. As they led him away in shackles, he turned to look at me one last time. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The media had turned me from suspected murderer into heroic victim overnight. Oil heiress helps FBI catch serial killer was much better publicity than my original headlines, and offers for book deals, movie rights, and interviews were pouring in. I declined them all. Some stories were too personal to share with the world. Marcus had done an excellent job managing the legal aftermath. All charges against me were dropped. My reputation was restored, and I was free to return to my quiet life on the estate. But quiet wasn't what I wanted anymore. Using my considerable resources and Harrison's law enforcement connections, I'd spent the past 6 months systematically destroying every aspect of Blake and Victoria's criminal network. Their co-conspirators were arrested. Their hidden assets were seized, and their reputations were obliterated so thoroughly that even their fellow inmates knew exactly what kind of monsters they were. Blake's gambling debts were still outstanding, and the people he owed money to weren't the forgiving type. Prison might actually be the safest place for him, though I'd made sure that information about his crimes and his family's wealth had reached the right ears. 25 years was going to feel much longer when you were constantly looking over your shoulder. For Victoria, I'd arranged something special. The families of her previous victims had been very interested to learn about her location and daily routines. Prison justice operates by its own rules, and serial killers who targeted elderly people aren't popular with the general population. But my greatest satisfaction came from my updated will. The principal foundation for my fortune would be used to help creatures who deserve love and care, rather than the human predators who tried to destroy me. Blake would inherit nothing except the knowledge that his greed had cost him everything. This morning, I received a letter from Blake. It was full of apologies, explanations, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. He claimed that Victoria had manipulated him, that he never intended for things to go so far, that he still loved me despite everything that had happened. I read the letter twice, then fed it into my fireplace. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness. Some wounds never heal. Blake had chosen Victoria and her blood money over the mother who'd given him everything, and now he could live with the consequences of that choice. As I sit here in my study, looking out at the oil derricks that have provided wealth and security for 3 generations of Prince Wells, I feel something I haven't experienced in months: peace. The estate feels like home again, no longer tainted by the presence of people who saw me as nothing more than a source of money. The rooms echo with memories of better times, when family meant something more than financial opportunity. I've hired a new housekeeper, updated my security systems, and changed all the locks. Blake's keys no longer work here, and he'll never set foot in this house again. My new will brings me daily satisfaction, knowing that every penny of my fortune will go to causes that matter, rather than the greedy hands that tried to steal it through murder. The Princewell name will survive, but it will be associated with generosity and compassion, rather than the kind of family dysfunction that Blake and Victoria represented. Tonight, I'll pour myself a glass of wine and toast to justice served. Not the kind that comes from courtrooms and judges, but the kind that comes from refusing to be anyone's victim. Blake and Victoria thought they were dealing with a lonely old woman who could be easily manipulated and disposed of. They learned too late that Colleen Princewell hadn't survived this long by being weak. Some people collect art or jewelry. I collect the satisfaction of watching my enemies destroy themselves through their own greed and stupidity. And in that collection, Blake and Victoria's downfall will always hold a place of honor.